All right. So, sometimes history throws some real curveballs at you, right? Like wars you've never even heard of.
Oh, yeah.
Like this whole war in the 70s over this region most people couldn't even point to on a map,
Right.
backed by the Soviets and the Cubans.
Yeah. It's a fascinating one.
Yeah, so we're talking about the Ogaden War.
The Ogaden War.
Somalia versus Ethiopia.
That's right.
Fighting over this area called the Ogaden.
Exactly.
And, well, it's got everything you could ask for in a good story.
It really does.
Yeah.
Twists
And turns and big surprises.
Huge surprises.
So,
yeah, this one is a great example of how a seemingly regional conflict can get really tangled up with these huge global players.
Yeah.
And Cold War tensions.
Right, exactly. And so that's kind of what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Using all the stuff you gave me.
Awesome.
So we're going to try to figure out, why this war happened in the first place, who all these players were, and, why it matters, even now, decades later.
It's still relevant today, for sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the roots of the conflict actually go way back.
Okay, so let's start with the basics then, I guess.
Sure.
Somalia and Ethiopia, we got those two players, but what is this Ogaden region?
Yeah, so the Ogaden is this big region. It's in southeastern Ethiopia.
Okay.
But here's the thing.
Okay.
Most of the people who live there are ethnic Somalis.
Oh, so you've got this, like, borderland area
Right.
with a mixed population ripe for conflict.
Yeah, you could say that.
Was this greater Somalia idea from the sources a factor here?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
That idea of Greater Somalia was really powerful back then. It was fueled by Somali nationalism.
Okay.
And the goal was to unite all ethnic Somalis.
Regardless of where they lived?
Exactly.
Wow.
Under one Somali nation.
Okay.
And they saw the Ogaden as like a key piece of that.
So I can see why that would lead to some territorial claims, especially with Somalia's leader at the time, Siad Barre.
Right. Siad Barre was very ambitious. He was really committed to that whole pan-Somali state idea.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you had Ethiopia's Marxist Derg regime.
Right, which had just come to power a few years before.
Exactly.
So right away, you've got this clash of ideologies.
You got it.
Nationalism versus Marxism.
Yep.
Each side with their own vision for the region.
And that tension eventually boiled over.
But how did it actually turn into a war?
Well,
Was it like just a matter of time?
I mean, there was a lot of political back and forth.
Yeah.
But then, in July of 1977, Somalia decided to make a move.
Okay.
They launched a full-on invasion of the Ogaden.
Wow, so they were serious.
Oh, yeah, they wanted to annex the territory.
To make it part of Somalia for good.
That was the goal.
This wasn't just some small border clash.
Nope.
This was a serious attempt to redraw the map.
Exactly. And they were actually pretty successful at first.
Really?
Yeah, the Somali forces had good equipment, they were motivated, and they ended up taking control of big chunks of territory.
Yeah.
Like cities that were really important strategically.
Oh, wow. Give me some examples.
Like Kibri Dahar and Dolo.
So it seemed like Somalia was really going to achieve its goal there for a minute?
It definitely seemed that way.
Wow.
But things were about to get a whole lot more complicated.
Oh, boy.
Thanks to some unexpected international players getting involved.
Okay, now I really want to hear what happens next.
Oh, this is where it gets good.
We've got this simmering tension, these competing ideologies of full-blown invasion. Where did these international players come in?
Well, let's just say they really changed the course of the war.
Okay, spill the beans.
All right, so this is where the Cold War really kicks in. And it gets, kind of complicated.
Oh, okay.
You might think, okay, Cold War, so one side gets the U.S. and the other gets the Soviets, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the usual setup.
Right, but it wasn't that simple this time.
Okay, I'm listening. Lay it on me. Who is backing who?
So at first, the Soviets were actually supporting Somalia.
Yeah, interesting.
They were sending them weapons and advisors.
Which probably helped them with those early victories we talked about.
Exactly.
So that makes sense on the surface, at least. Classic Cold War rivalry.
Right.
If the U.S. is backing Ethiopia, the Soviets want to counter that.
Yeah, but here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The Soviets completely switched sides.
Wait, what?
They ditched Somalia and threw their support behind Ethiopia.
Wow, hold on. They changed sides in the middle of the war.
Yep, pretty much.
That's a bold move. What made them do that?
Well, it was partly strategic, but ideology played a big role too.
Okay.
So Ethiopia's Marxist Derg regime,
Yeah.
They were ideologically aligned with the Soviets.
So they were a more appealing ally than Somalia.
Exactly. Plus, Ethiopia was in a more strategic location.
Right, it's all about location, location, location.
So that's right. So the Soviets saw an opportunity to boost a communist ally.
And get a stronger foothold in the region.
You got it. It was realpolitik in action.
Wow, so they weren't messing around either.
Oh, no, they went all in. Huge shipments of weapons to Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Tons of military advisors.
To train the Ethiopian troops.
Yep. But get this, that's not even the most surprising part.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. Remember how we talked about Cuban involvement?
Yeah, go.
Hold on to your hats, because around 15,000 Cuban troops ended up fighting alongside the Ethiopians.
Oh, wait, Cuban troops in Africa?
You heard that right.
That seems totally random. What were they doing there?
Well, it might seem strange at first.
Yeah.
But when you think about Cuba's history and their alliance with the Soviet Union, it starts to make a bit more sense.
So both Cuba and the Soviet Union were committed to spreading communism.
Exactly. And they saw this war as a chance to do just that.
So for Cuba, it was a mix of ideology and loyalty to the Soviets.
Pretty much. But 15,000 troops, that's a big commitment.
Yeah. Did they actually make a difference in the fighting?
Oh, yeah, big time.
Okay.
The Cuban troops were a real force to be reckoned with, especially in that rough terrain, the Ogaden.
Yeah.
And their arrival, plus all that extra Soviet support, really turned the tide of the war.
So what happened? Did Ethiopia start winning?
Yeah, all that Soviet weaponry and Cuban military know-how really shifted the balance of power.
Wow.
The Ethiopian forces, they got a new lease on life, They pushed back against the Somalis.
So by early 1978, they'd taken back most of the territory they'd lost.
That's right.
It's amazing how quickly things changed.
It is.
Somalia went from almost winning to losing in just a few months.
Yeah, it really shows you how much outside help can change things in a war.
And for Somalia, that outside help was devastating.
Definitely. They were losing more and more soldiers, running out of supplies.
And everyone was telling them to back off.
Exactly. So by March 1978, they had to pull out of the Ogaden.
Which basically ended the war.
Pretty much.
But wars always leave scars, even if we forget about them.
That's true.
What about the human cost of this conflict?
Yeah, the human toll was huge. Thousands of soldiers died on both sides, and countless civilians got caught in the middle or lost their homes.
And it probably led to a big refugee crisis.
It did. Somalis fled to Kenya, and Ethiopians were displaced within their own country.
It's a sad reminder that behind all the politics and strategies, real people get hurt.
Absolutely.
So the war is over, but what happens next?
Well, for Somalia, the defeat was a real blow. Siad Barre's regime was already facing problems.
And this just made things worse.
It did, and it's kind of ironic,
So,
The war was supposed to unite Somalis, but it actually ended up tearing them apart even more.
wow.
It led to more internal conflicts and clan warfare in the years that followed.
So their ambitions backfired in a way.
You could say that, did Ethiopia come out of it okay, though?
I mean, they won, but...
It wasn't that simple.
Okay.
They won, but the war showed their weaknesses too, and it caused more dissent within Ethiopia.
So they had their own problems to deal with.
Exactly. They faced resistance from various groups, and eventually they were overthrown too in 1991.
So even the winner didn't really escape the consequences.
Nope. And the legacy of this war is still felt in the Horn of Africa today.
In what way?
Well, the Ogaden region is still a point of contention between Somalia and Ethiopia.
So even though the war is over, the issues that caused it are still there.
Exactly. And the involvement of the Soviets and Cubans back then contributed to the instability that you still see in the region today.
It's hard to believe that a fight over one piece of land could have such a lasting impact.
I know, it's remarkable.
But before we move on to the legacy of the war, I want to go back to something you said earlier.
Sure.
You mentioned that the Ogaden region is still a problem between Somalia and Ethiopia.
It is.
What's the situation there now?
Well, even though the fighting stopped in 1978, the territorial dispute is still unresolved.
So the Ogaden is still part of Ethiopia?
Yes. But there are groups within the region like the Ogaden National Liberation Front, or ONLF.
What do they want?
They're fighting for more autonomy or even independence.
So even though the war ended, the fight for control of the Ogaden continues.
Exactly, and the involvement of the Soviets and Cubans during the war really left its mark on the Horn of Africa.
How so?
It made the Cold War tensions worse there, fueled proxy conflicts, and added to the whole mess of alliances and rivalries that still affects the region's politics today.
It It's crazy to think that one conflict could have such a ripple effect and shape things for decades to come.
It really is, and it shows how interconnected global politics is and how what seems like a local conflict can blow up into something much bigger.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It does, and it reminds us that we need to understand history, even the parts that seem far away or unimportant.
Because those events can still affect us today.
Exactly.
Yeah, it really is a lot to think about. This whole idea that a war most people have never even heard of could have such a huge impact on the region and even like ripple out into global politics.
Absolutely. And it shows you why it's so important to understand history. Even the events that seem kind of obscure or far away from our own lives, because the Ogaden War might be over, but it still shapes the Horn of Africa today. And it reminds us that international relations are complicated.
It makes you wonder how many other forgotten wars are out there, each with their own ripple effects and lessons we could learn from.
More than you might think. And each one gives us this look into a specific time and place. A chance to really see the forces that shape our world and maybe even understand current conflicts a little better.
You mentioned that this war wasn't just about land, that it was also about these competing nationalisms and Cold War stuff. Can you talk about that a bit more? Like, what were the deeper motivations going on?
Well, yeah, the desire for land was definitely a big factor, especially for Somalia and their whole greater Somalia thing. But if you look closer at those sources you gave me, it's clear that the conflict was also fueled by ethnic tensions, the legacy of colonialism, and that global power struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It's kind of like a proxy war, with both superpowers wanting to control the region.
It's amazing how all these different things, ethnic tensions, Cold War rivalries, and wanting more territory all came together to create this really explosive situation.
It is, and it shows why understanding the historical context is so important. You can't really understand the Ogaden War without thinking about the Cold War and the effects of colonialism in Africa.
It's like a reminder that history is rarely simple. It's usually a mix of different motivations, ideologies, and unexpected consequences.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so interesting. Don't you think there's always something new to discover, more layers to peel back, and more insights to find?
For sure. So for our listeners who are now hooked on this story and want to learn more, what would you suggest? Like, are there any books, documentaries, or other resources they could check out?
Oh, yeah. There are some great resources out there if you want to go deeper.
Mm.
I'd suggest starting with some articles on the Cold War in Africa to get a good grasp of the historical context. There are also a few books that focus specifically on the Ogaden War that offer different perspectives. And, of course, there's always the internet with tons of primary sources and historical accounts if you're feeling adventurous.
Perfect. We'll be sure to put some links to those resources in the show notes for everyone. And a huge thank you to you for taking us through this fascinating and often overlooked part of history.
It was my pleasure. It's always great to share these stories and shed light on the complexities of the past.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Ogaden War. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more. Remember, history is full of surprises, and sometimes the most unexpected stories are the ones that teach us the most valuable lessons. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of the past.